Just wrapping up Old Testament resurrection, it's there. Without, to encapsulate the part of the last week's lesson, Old Testament resurrection, it's there. Without having to manipulate the text or argue, well, it's not there unless you bring in the Persians' views of afterlife or Greek views of the afterlife, and you get into the intertestamental period. And so you have these outside influences that are shaping interpretations of the Old Testament. No, it's there. Resurrection is in the Old Testament. When Jesus started teaching his views of resurrection, in Judaism, nobody says, what are you talking about in the life of Christ? They knew what it was. And they knew it was not what the Greeks and the Romans and other people said it was, as we'll see whenever we look at the Persians and the Greek here in a bit. And so there's a certain atmosphere in which the teachings of Christ found in the Gospels and then the writings of Paul and John and others in the New Testament essentially take what Jesus said about resurrection, and they don't build upon it, but they continue to reinforce it by making it the heart of their teachings. If you were to ask Paul, you can preach the gospel all you want, but quit mentioning the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, he would do one of two things. He'd either give up the Christian faith altogether, or he would defiantly look you in the eye and say, absolutely not. Paul could never do what he did without continually advocating the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's at the heart of it. It's there. And it's not because Jesus was the first one to start teaching it. It's there within Judaism. It's not new by the time Christ's earthly ministry begins. It's there 400 years before Christ. It's there 600 years. It's there a good 700 or so years well before Christ. So Old Testament resurrection is there. There's resuscitation, but there's also resurrection as well. So just to wrap up a couple of points, exile and resurrection in the Old Testament often go hand in glove with one another in the sense that we often read throughout the Old Testament where the Israelites are in the land, and then they're exiled from the land, and then they're restored to the land. That's often a metaphor for resurrection, because when they're in the land, they're alive with God. And then when they are exiled, then it's as if they are in that post-mortem pre-resurrection state. And they're in that intermediate state. And then when God restores them to the land, that's often a metaphor for a new creation, for restoring the relationship between God and his people. Yes?
You say often, like, where might I find this? Where is this metaphor used?
Well, I don't have anything specific in mind, but it is often found, not every instance in which exile and restoration is talked about. Sometimes it's exile and restoration, but oftentimes it's couched within language that is demonstrative of a metaphor. When it is used in Isaiah, that language in the chapters 24 through 27, the language of exile and restoration is used, but it's elevated by using other types of terms and concepts so that they work together in the sense that Isaiah the prophet is being commanded by God to tell the Israelites more than just you're coming back to the land. He's telling the Israelites, I'm going to do something even better than that, than restore you to the land. I think, if I didn't, I think I mentioned that in connection with, chapters 24 through 27, they talk about restoration on the level of cosmic judgment, that it's not just the Jews coming back to the land, but that judgment is going to be much more broad beyond just Israel. Well, the non-Jews aren't restored to the land. There's got to be something more to it than that. And what Isaiah is talking about in chapters 24 through 27 is, yes, exactly. It's more than just getting the Jews back to the land. This is often where even modern Judaism ultimately fails in understanding their own scriptures, the Jewish scriptures. It's not about 1948 creating the state of Israel and all's right with the world, which obviously, especially in the light of circumstances in the last several months, all's not right with the world. The ultimate goal in the Old Testament, before Jesus came to earth and before he began his ministry, the ultimate goal was something more than just getting Israel back to the land. And that ties into, and I think we looked at this 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, when we talked a little bit about Abraham. And we're familiar with those, the passages in Genesis 12 through 15, where God's going to make him a father of a great people beyond just the Jews. It's much more than that. And that kind of gets shuffled off to the side, and often exile and restoration passages are exclusively seen as the main point. And it never is the main point all throughout the Old Testament. And there are modern evangelicals that feel like all's right with the world as long as the Jews are in Israel. Because God, and the argument usually is, well, God has never broken a promise. His covenants have never been broken. He will keep those promises, and his promise was to restore Israel to the land. Well, that's what happened, so God's will is being achieved by having the state of Israel. That's not God's ultimate goal in the Old Testament. God's ultimate goal was that all people surrounding the Jews would see them faithfully worshiping God, and others would be drawn into that. He wants redemption for the entire creation. Also, when restoration and exile language is used, it's sometimes used in connection with creation language. When you start talking about using creation language, it harkens back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And when you start talking about restoring the people to the land, it's more than, and you're using creation language to do that, it's more than just simply getting them back to the land. It's about a new creation. Well, that entails a new body. That entails ultimately resurrection. Does that help? Okay. I apologize for not having specific passages, but I can work on that if you like. Didn't mean to put you off, Alan. But what we have a tendency to do is resurrection stuff is in the Old Testament is resurrection, and exile and restoration stuff is exile and restoration, and they don't have anything to do with each other. They're often closer than we have a tendency to think. So there are those instances where you can pull out specific passages, and it sounds like, well, what God's ultimately going for is to get Israel back, or get the Jews back to Israel. But often that's couched in language in which it's much, much, much more than that. It's not just getting the Jews back to a plot of land, which was never God's goal to begin with. So some overall conclusions about Old Testament resurrection, and not just tied to the passages that we looked at last week, but also some of the things that we looked at before. There are basically three positions, and there are variations of this, but there's primarily three positions in regard to what happens to the dead in the Old Testament. First of all, and we did see this with language that was used with Abraham, they sleep with or they join their dead ancestors. And the language that's often used is that it's not just they're dead. Life has gone out of them. We stick them in the ground, and Abraham's with his dead ancestors in the ground. No, the language that's used is Abraham was with his forefathers somewhere beyond just this life, this earth. Number two, they are received by God in a continuing life. Once again, they're not just evaporated or annihilated and magically disappear. And those are more the exceptions than they are the rules, like Enoch and Elijah. But there is something there beyond just, once again, annihilation. And then third, some dead will experience bodily resurrection to a new life, which is in post-Old Testament scripture and leading into the first century AD is elevated to the point of a universal resurrection of the dead, both righteous and the unrighteous, so that there is life after death. It's not just, well, you're dead and you're gone, and there's really not a whole lot more to that. Ultimately, even in the Old Testament, it's not just a New Testament thing, but even in the Old Testament, resurrection is hope. And it's not just hope, and it's often viewed this way, especially whenever you have like the passage in Daniel where it's connected to martyrdom. In other words, for those of you who have died in the faith, I'm going to raise you to new life. And those that killed you, I will raise them to new punishment. It's more than just that in the sense of having justice or even revenge. It is a universal sense of hope. So once again, it's not just getting back to the land. It's not just saying, well, here we are back on the eastern end of the Mediterranean in this little chunk of land between Syria to the north and Egypt to the south, and this is all that God is going for. There is overwhelmingly a sense of hope in the resurrection, that language that is used. And since the language of bodily resurrection and restoration of Israel from exile is often intertwined, it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between the two. And I think that's intentional. We have a tendency in our post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution approach to these type of issues, want to split hairs and figure out which are the passages that have to do with exile and restoration and which are the ones that have to do with resurrection, and we'll look on them in those contexts. And the reality is otherwise, they kind of blend with one another, because in an ancient Jewish mind, they blended with one another, and they thought along those lines. Exile, restoration, resurrection, they kind of get mixed up, and it's okay. For us, it's less of it's much more of an issue. It's unnecessary in the Old Testament at this point in salvation history to fully reveal the doctrine of and the theological significance of bodily resurrection, because that's going to be fully revealed in Christ's ministry, and we're building toward that. It's not a matter of, well, why doesn't Isaiah and Hosea and all the other authors of the Old Testament just lay it all out for us? It would be really nice, and I've mentioned this more than once, if Paul would have done the same thing, and John, instead of using sort of cloudy and obfuscated language, just say what you mean. Well, part of it is we can't really have a full understanding of bodily resurrection in the Old Testament until the time of Christ, when he begins teaching in part about bodily resurrection, but ultimately when it's achieved with his own bodily resurrection. And I made reference to this last week, and we'll look at this passage again, but the passage in John where Jesus is about to raise Lazarus from the dead, and Martha has a full understanding of resurrection, she thinks. And Jesus is basically coming along and saying, no, it's actually a lot more than you think. There's a lot more to it. So a full and complete understanding in the Old Testament wasn't necessary. A full and complete understanding before Christ's ministry is not necessary. But we're building ultimately toward that when there will be a greater revelation, a greater understanding with Christ's ministry. And something that we'll look at in a moment, it's really, it's not possible to say, well, Old Testament resurrection has to do with the influence of Persians and Zoroastrianism and their ideas of resuscitation or reconstitution, and that's where it really comes from. It can't, because the writings in which these passages are coming from predate the exposure of the Persians and their contact with the Jews, and also because Old Testament resurrection is uniquely couched within the teachings of the Old Testament. They're there, first of all, and it's uniquely tied to them as a people and God's plan for them, as well as God's overall plan for salvation history. Now, Old Testament resurrection, you'll notice we didn't go well before the prophets. We only dealt with three of the prophets. Well, no, four of the prophets, actually. And Old Testament resurrection, in regard to the entire context of the Old Testament, is a little bit later. And that's probably intentional in having this underdeveloped concept of it, because it removes any hints of connecting Judaism with some of those early pagan cults that have vegetation deities, where you have a god that dies and is raised from the dead, and then the next year the god dies and is raised from the dead, because it has to do with agriculture and the seasons, the planting of dead seeds in the ground, and then they come forth in the spring and there's new life, and that sort of connection at the time in which these concepts are emerging, Judaism isn't in contact with those type of pagan practices and those type of pagan ideas. And it is progressively limited to some of the prophetic writings that are clearly found within Judaism. So it's not, and I've read a little bit about this, that you do have those scholars that come along and say, well, when you have an outside pagan mythology where you have a god that dies in the wintertime and then is raised back to life in the springtime, and there's worship connected to that, to those type of vegetation deities, well, that's where the Jews get the idea from. Well, no, because at the time that these concepts are arising, their pagan connections, if you like, are found primarily in Babylon and Syria, and they don't have vegetation deities. You can't find these type of things there. So once again, you're going to have to look someplace else. And then finally, the Old Testament addresses resurrection, often using very clear, concise language, standing up, awakening, where if you're going to interpret it as something other than resurrection, then the responsibility is on the person to start reading into that text something the text doesn't say. In other words, even though it may not necessarily seem like it with the passages that we looked at last week, within its historic and doctrinal context, those passages are clearly and concisely describe and express the concept of resurrection, in the sense that you really have a problem if you want to turn it into something other than Old Testament resurrection. Then if you decide that Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14 isn't resurrection, then you have a huge hurdle you have to get over to demonstrate that it's something other than that. And especially the passage in Daniel 12. Hardly anybody, even people who don't really see Old Testament resurrection throughout a lot of passages in the Old Testament, will argue, okay, Daniel 12 is resurrection. But then a lot of people will say, but it doesn't come from Judaism, it doesn't come from the Old Testament. It's got to come from the Persians, the Greeks, someplace else. But at least they'll admit it is a resurrection passage. They just, it will not admit that its source is found within Judaism. So the point is ultimately this: if you're going to redefine the passages that we looked at, and this is not me saying this is a mound of other scholars, New Testament, Old Testament scholars that argue this. If you're going to reinterpret the passages that we looked at outside of resurrection, good luck with that. Then you start to have a great inconsistency, because then you have to interpret one passage as something other than, and then this passage can't have a connection with the other passage and has to be reinterpreted another way. In other words, there's less continuity among these passages, and they don't flow together historically in developing the idea of resurrection. And then also, even in the Old Testament, when resurrection is dealt with, it's not resuscitation. It's not bringing somebody dead back to life, to the same life that they had before. It is resurrection, and the language that's used is resurrection language. It's the reversal of death. An idea that's there in the New Testament, but will be expounded upon a little bit more. I have to be careful. I don't want to say, well, Jesus comes along and puts his own spin on resurrection. No, he comes along and he teaches the same resurrection in his teachings that are found in the Old Testament. His teachings and the New Testament's teachings about resurrection are not new. It's just that there's going to be greater understanding and revelation of what they mean, especially in the light of Jesus' own resurrection. That's when the apostles start to get it. When they went on a field trip. It's different whenever your teacher tells you in class theoretically, how spoons are made. But when you go to a factory and actually see metal spoons being made, then it clicks. And it's kind of that same way with resurrection. The teachings of resurrection are embraced in the first century in Judaism. Jesus' followers embraced resurrection, but they had their own ideas. But after his resurrection, it's kind of like, oh, now I really understand what he was talking about. And even then, maybe not even fully, completely understanding what it means. So bodily resurrection is inherent in the Old Testament. It's not something that's newly interpreted in the intertestamental period. It's not something that's going to be taken and expanded upon and developed. There's just going to be more clarification once we finally get to the New Testament. And this is not a pagan intrusion. It's not a reinterpretation as a result of the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. It's there. It's clearly and blatantly and abundantly there. It's just not fully developed in its context. It will be. It will continue to be developed so that there's going to be greater and better understanding of it. Any questions about Old Testament resurrection before we move on, which I'm sure everybody's pressing for?
Yeah, there's one thing in the book of Job. We see the concept of bodily resurrection and a kinsman redeemer fully developed. And Job was not that long after Noah, before all these other pagan cultures could have even developed. There was the fact of a bodily resurrection and of a kinsman redeemer.
Mm-hmm. And then there are some, I'm not disagreeing with you, Tom, but there are those that will say, but there's also passages in there that clearly and abundantly express the idea that there is no life after death. And this is something that I was unaware of. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, somebody tacks on a phrase, and I'll bring this up whenever we get to it because I can't remember it, but somebody tacks on a phrase at the end of the Greek translation that states, essentially, Job lived after his death, that it left this sense of there was a resurrection. But yeah, I agree completely. Job's a little tricky because you can, and scholars do this all the time. They'll look in the same book and see, well, here's this position, but look, this is the exact opposite position.
Job vacillates back and forth between hope and despair.
Mm-hmm.
You see him going through a horrible time.
Mm-hmm.
And all the while, he's declaring that he's righteous and he's demanding his day in court with God. God gives it to him.
Mm-hmm. In more than one sense.
Right. By the 19th chapter, you see him beginning to grow spiritually,
Mm-hmm.
where his friends really aren't. But you see the faith that Job has, even though he's in this horrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, yet though I die, yet in my flesh I will see God. I will see him with my own eyes, not through the eyes of another.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, he vacillates between despair and hope, but you see him growing and coming closer to God through the trials that he was undergoing.
Mm-hmm. I agree completely. Job's a great book, and there's been a request that we go through Job, and we will. I know it sounds strange, but I like Job. It's very human. And I think part of what you're saying also is that the fact that he progresses a bit more than his friends is because not just that he gets it, but he's drawn closer to God. There's that relational aspect of drawing closer in a relationship to God helps him to understand things a little bit better than just doctrine. I've got the bullet points and can't do them anymore. But because his relationship with God seems to be enhanced, he gets it. And because he's been through what he's been through, he gets it as well. I think I'm assuming, I haven't read a lot about it, but I think that's why somebody tacked on a phrase at the end of the Greek translation of Job, making sure we understand clearly in context of those more despairing passages, Job will be raised from the dead. I think the translator wanted that hope stuck on there at the end. I was completely unaware of this. I've only recently, I think Carla got me a copy of the Septuagint recently, a year ago or so, for Christmas, a year and a half, however long it's been. So I haven't really been plowing through the Septuagint too often, but there are things about it that are rather interesting. And the translations, and I think I noted this last week, our Jewish or Hebrew Old Testament will sometimes translate the passages that we looked at almost negatively, and then the Greek comes along and translates it in a much more positive, resurrection-affirming way, that it's a little bit clearer, pointing to the fact that they're starting to develop these notions of resurrection where they're starting to get it and have, I think, a better understanding of it. Any other questions or statements before we move on? Well, originally it was not my intention to look at any ideas of resurrection outside of the Old Testament or the New Testament, but a few months ago I thought better of it, and so but I'm not going to do. We're not going to have a whole laundry list of looking at all the different religious groups and cultural groups and ethnic groups. I just want to highlight, and there's a specific reason. It's not just because I couldn't think anything else to do for the next lesson. I want to just briefly look at the Persians and then in a little bit more detail look at the Greeks, primarily for two reasons. First of all, because not alongside them, but at the same time, Judaism is beginning to develop its doctrine or clarify its doctrine of resurrection. And it's not what we find in the Persians, and it's not what we find in the Greeks. But also, when first century Judaism, late Second Temple Judaism is developing, and when Christ's ministry begins, these concepts are on the ground. And so when Jesus is doing his various and sundry teachings, including his teachings about resurrection, the Jews have their understanding, and then basically everybody else has their understanding. And especially when we look at a little bit more detail on the Greeks, there's a myriad. And when I started reading about the Greeks and their views of the afterlife, I thought, okay, this will take about a month, because there's all these, I boiled it down to two. There's basically two approaches to the afterlife among the Greeks. But that's the idea. When the Roman Empire is there and on the ground, and Jesus' ministry begins, and then his death, burial, and resurrection, and then the apostles begin their ministry, then not so much Jesus within the context of Judaism, because his ministry it's not often outside of ministry among the Jews. But when the apostles begin to go out, they butt heads with people that would look at them and wonder, why are these people talking about bodily resurrection? Because there is no bodily resurrection. And especially Paul is making it the keystone and the heart of his gospel. And he doesn't pull away from it. And so it's when that within the context of, will the Jews embrace bodily resurrection? But Jesus comes along to give a little bit more clarity and then to demonstrate resurrection. And then the apostles, when they go out into the Roman Empire, they have to butt heads with people who just think it's stupid. Hopefully that's not too scholarly of a term for you, but it's just flat stupid to believe in bodily resurrection, and they never would. So I can't imagine what it would be like to be the Apostle Paul and trying to go to the agora, that is to the city market, and have all of these Greeks and Romans and other Gentiles, and trying to get them to slow down and not just blow you off or laugh at you or roll your eyes, and they keep on walking past you when you start talking about bodily resurrection, and making it even more complicated because you're talking about God dying and being raised from the dead. Gods don't have bodies, or do they? So there's a lot of things that Paul and other apostles had to deal with. But anyway, just some of the background, the context, the cultural context, that in the right before the intertestamental period, the fifth and 4th centuries, Judaism will come into contact with the Persian Empire, the time of Cyrus the Great, and when he conquers the Babylonians, and then he's eventually going to allow the Jews to return to the land of Israel. But the official religion of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about Zoroastrianism. It is a monotheistic religion. I always thought we knew a lot about Zoroastrianism, but as I started reading a bit about it, we hardly know anything about it. But in the 6th century, the Persian Zoroastrianism, which is a dualistic monotheism, will be there on the ground when Judaism pretty much has developed a lot of its ideas about bodily resurrection. Now, in regard to Zoroastrianism, they have a concept, we think, which is often termed reconstitution of the body, which is basically like resuscitation, where a dead body is brought back to life the same way that it was before it was dead. That reconstitution is close to resuscitation. But as a dualistic religion, they have a very dim view of the body. In other words, it's kind of that Greek idea that the body is bad and the spirit or the soul is good. So much so that the Persians, instead of burying their dead, would expose their dead, kind of like some Native American cultures would do that. You expose the body, you lay the body out, and then, the decomposition in animals and insects and things like that break down the body, because the body is not really important. The body not being important is not biblical. It's not Old Testament and it's not New Testament. So the idea that reconstitution of the body coming out of Zoroastrianism, having an influence on Judaism and its ideas of resurrection are just at a great disconnect. It's not possible for one to influence the other. So there's also no clear demonstration or connection between Zoroastrian ideas and Judaism. We can't see anybody coming along and saying, well, here's the link. When this Jewish individual began writing and developing his ideas, he's clearly influenced because he's reading these sources or something like that. So there's not a historic connection between Zoroastrianism and Judaism. The beliefs of ancient Zoroastrianism, once again, are not fully understood, and there is no sense of eschatology, a new creation, which would include a new bodily resurrection. They have very different views about the afterlife, what happens to the body, and the importance of the body. And also something I've mentioned at least twice before, if the Persians were influencing the ideas of resurrection in Judaism, then they were doing it before the Persians were around. In other words, it's found in Hosea and Isaiah, and Hosea and Isaiah are not writing at the time that Judaism was in contact with the Persians. And then even the passage of Ezekiel 37, the Valley of Dry Bones, if that was influenced by the Persians, then why do we have buried bodies, at least in the last few verses, why do we have bodies buried in the ground being raised from the dead? Because the Persians didn't do that. So there's a lot of problems with the Persian Zoroastrianism being an influence on Old Testament resurrection. It's really not there. And we kind of can find some of those concepts floating around in the first century AD during Christ's ministry and those of the apostles. Then in regard to the Greeks, we can boil it down basically to two approaches. One is, this is it. This life is all there is, and there is no afterlife. In other words, a type of annihilationism. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, that there is kind of a sense of an afterlife, but it's not important. There's this life and what you can do with your body and what you can enjoy in this world, and then you die, and then that's it. And then the other alternative is, well, this life isn't actually the most important, and our bodies are not that important. It's the soul. Therefore, death is a good thing because death causes the soul to escape the body, which is a bad thing, and it's the afterlife which is more important, not this life. Well, neither of those positions will align with the Scriptures, in which this life and the next life are both important. Our bodies before resurrection and after resurrection are both important and divinely made. And so resurrection is the plan, and the Greeks don't embrace that. You don't have to worry about these individuals, but late 6th, early 5th century Greek Aeschylus, in his work Eumenides, will have the god Apollo state, once a man has died, there is no resurrection. You will not come back. You die, and then that's it. Life is ended. So there's nothing beyond this existence. In the 5th century, Sophocles and Herodotus both rejected the idea that the dead would return to life or even to this world, even as spirits or ghosts or anything along those lines. For the Greeks, resurrection or even resuscitation was contrary to wisdom and practical knowledge, and quite frankly, being raised from the dead was distasteful and disgusting. The idea that your body would come back to life, especially as in resuscitation, was abhorrent to the Greeks. They would not embrace that in any way, shape, or form for more than one reason. So once again, we've got a problem. If you're developing your ideas of resurrection, you're not going to look to the Greeks, because in the Old Testament, the body is something that will be raised from the dead. Most even denied existence beyond this life. There was a very common epitaph that you would often find among the Greek city-states during the Roman Republic and even in the Roman Empire. You would often find this on tombstones, and it was so common it would be abbreviated with 4 letters, and it was translated, quote, "I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care." And that was it. In other words, I was not, there was a time when I didn't exist. I was born. I am, I'm now dead. And then who cares after that? Because there's nothing else beyond just this life. So there was a time before me, there's a time after me, and I'm just this little slip of time in between. When I was born, I lived, and then I died. And then the in-between is all that there is. So it's rather fatalistic, which also means, as much as a struggle as it was for the apostles to try and convince people of bodily resurrection, there is hope in that. If you remember from 1 Corinthians, there's very clearly the idea of hope that's found in resurrection, so that you can say, I was not, I was, I am, but not I do not care, but I will be even better than I am now. So there is actually a hope that's found in the New Testament and even in the Old Testament. Many philosophers argue that the dead simply didn't exist. The Epicureans believed the soul, like the body, was made of particles, and when the body died, the soul evaporated. It just disappeared. In other words, a type of annihilationism. Plato noted that the soul continued after death in sort of a dreamless sleep, but he also had other views of the afterlife that we'll briefly look at. So the Greek afterlife sometimes is connected to the pantheon, the Greek and Roman pantheon, and their myths involving the underworld, Hades, which is not hell. But by the 1st century BC, about a century before the time of Christ, most reject the idea of Hades and most embrace annihilationism. In other words, I was not, I was, I am, I do not care. I died, and that's the end of it. There's nothing beyond our existence today. Although there are those that will argue there is life beyond this life, but it's a disembodied soul that lives. So the 2 main positions are often connected to Homer, the 8th century Greek poet, and Plato. And so in Homer's writings and his poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Iliad, this is either a source for or a reflection of the idea of the dead residing in Hades, which is, once again, it's not hell, it's not Sheol, it's not the Christian hell. Although, and there wasn't a lot of explanation in my sources for this, one's soul cannot enter Hades until your body has had a proper burial, even though the body's not important. But until you have an actual proper burial, your soul can't enter into Hades. Please don't ask me any questions about that, because I couldn't get any questions answered about that. Why? My question was why? What does it matter? If our bodies are so important, who cares if you just suddenly drop dead in a ditch, and then your body decomposes? But anyway, that seemed to be important in Homer anyway. In the Odysseus, Hades is described as a place without joy for disembodied souls. It's just kind of a place where you hang out. You're sad, you're angry, but there's really no sense of reward or benefit or anything along those lines. And even the best places of Hades are worse than the worst places of this earth. In other words, the worst that this life afforded is better than the best that Hades can afford, making it very clear this life is better than the next life. So live it up, because there's really nothing beyond this. All souls in Hades are subhuman. They are less than they were than when they were people on earth. Since the body held more meaningful experiences in this world, life is hopeless in Hades. Since it had no purpose, it had no meaning, it had no opportunity for a better life. So this is pretty much it, what we have now. Yes?
With the Persians and the Greeks, I can understand their influence. What about the Egyptians and the Romans? A lot of times think of Rome as Greece 2.0, especially art and culture. Is there any influence from the Egyptian afterlife and the Roman afterlife?
The little bit I read about the Egyptians, no, because they're very early, and because they had such vastly different views of the dead, the afterlife. You know, the tombs sort of exemplify what the Egyptians believed, that you need material goods to enjoy the next life. There is a sense of an afterlife, but it's very different, and it's so early in the history of Israel that there doesn't seem to be any flow of connection between the two. And yeah, the lower class folk, there is a sense of an afterlife, but nowhere near what it would have been for the aristocracy, the pharaohs, and people that were prominent and could afford such an afterlife. The Romans are basically, you're right, they're the Greeks 2.0. So for the most part, whatever the Greeks believe, the Romans basically believe the same thing. So annihilationism or a disembodied soul in an afterlife. Although another term that's connected with the Roman Empire is syncretism. The Romans had a tendency to cobble together religious views. And as long as you're paying your taxes and you're not rioting, the Romans didn't really care whether you worshiped yourself, your ancestors, Yahweh. They really didn't care about religion. And so they had a tendency to be very syncretistic. They would pull together types of religions. And it's through the Roman Empire that a lot of, and we'll look at this with first century, I think we'll look at this with first century Judaism, that this is the same time in which Gnosticism and a few other ideas are starting to emerge. They come out of the Central Asia, out of the East, that aren't really Roman. And there is a sense of an afterlife, but not something you would find among the Greeks and the Romans, but not that you find in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So Rome is just kind of replicating what the Greeks had. They just transmit what the Greeks did. Romans were great appropriators. Yeah, they built things like the Colosseum with a tremendous invention of concrete. But as a matter of fact, their concrete is actually better than ours. That's why most of the Colosseum is still standing there. Yeah, and all the aqueducts and the amphitheaters and things like that. The reason why so much of that is standing so much effectively is because they had we think volcanic ash was the trick to keeping their concrete together. But anyway, they basically swiped a lot of stuff from the Greeks. So their ideas, we often use the term Greco-Roman, and it's whether it's first century BC or first century AD, is basically the same concept. So this idea of annihilationism, the Romans would have been right there. They would have agreed that this is it. That's why that epitaph that I mentioned, I was not, I was, I am, I do not care. That was a Greek epitaph that's just carried over into the Roman Empire.
What was the transition from a Greek century to a Roman century?
Oh, you're getting out of my jurisdiction at this point. I'm assuming that it starts to decline 3rd, 2nd century BC when the Roman Republic really begins to take over and they start conquering in the peninsula, in the Italian peninsula, and then start radiating out from there. But the Greeks were over in the southern part of the Italian peninsula down in Sicily. They'd been there for quite some time. So I know the Romans were influenced, but as far as military action and empire and all that stuff, 1st century BC definitely and beyond. That won't be on the test, by the way. Then secondly, Plato. Plato's a late 5th, early 4th century BC philosopher. He was a dualist, and he's the opposite of Homer. Homer was basically, this is it, this life, and what you get out of this life is it, and the next life doesn't really matter. With Plato, it was more of a matter of the body's not really important. The soul is what is immortal, and therefore death is a release of the soul. Leave your body behind and allow your soul to be elevated, and this gets picked up with Neoplatonism, 3rd century AD, and then Gnosticism, which probably emerges 1st or 2nd century. This idea that it's the next life that's more important, and this life is not as important. So it's the opposite position of Homer and annihilationism. It's the fact that the soul is who we really are, not the body. The body is unimportant. It's the true self. The body is ephemeral. It's temporal. And so this world and this life, it's a delusion. And ultimately, what we're going for is the immortality of the soul and the next life and all of those type of things. Now, this is probably what few people in the time of Christ and the apostles are embracing. They're probably more along the lines of, well, this is it, so I got to get what I can and enjoy as much of life as I possibly can. But even for Plato, Hades, there is a Hades. It can be a place of pleasure and enjoyment. It can also be a place of judgment. And it can also be a place of despair or punishment for individuals. Confusingly, sometimes Plato talked about what we might call reincarnation. Sometimes he talked about that a soul would leave a body and go into another body, which seems contrary to the rest of Plato's writings where you're trying to escape the body. But sometimes he would talk about how the soul could do that, but that wasn't the majority of his position. But the dead souls are released from the body. They dwell in Hades. There is a virtuous life in Hades. There are benefits, there are rewards, but there's also punishment for people who are immoral, which, believe it or not, punishment is a good thing because it demonstrates justice, and justice is always a good thing. There are also some other developing ideas during the first century AD and beyond the 100s, 200s. The idea of Gnosticism reinforces this idea that the body is bad and this life is not most important, but it's the next life. It's what one does with one's soul in elevating your knowledge and your consciousness. There are a couple of Romans, first century BC, first century AD, that will argue that death was inevitable and therefore it's irrelevant. It should be embraced. It will release you from trouble. There's really no reason to fear death at all. One gentleman, Epictetus, described a person as, quote, a little soul carrying around a corpse, unquote. In other words, it's the soul that's more important, and even more than Plato, Epictetus and Seneca will argue that the next life is the better life, and you shouldn't be afraid of death. The fact that they reinforce this idea that death is something to not be feared is probably an argument that people were afraid of death and terrified of the next life because they didn't really know. Now, if you remember when we looked at the Daniel passage, it talked about the stars and how the dead will be like the stars. Well, Seneca will argue that our souls are made of the same stuff as stars, and when we die, our souls go back to the stars. That's called astral immortality. I almost said immorality. Astral immortality, because since the soul is ethereal and it's made of the same substance, it's trying to get back to the stars. But the point is this. This is the form of eternity that we have, and this life is really unimportant. It doesn't really mean anything. There are also some early Greek writings that will advocate the idea that the dead will join the Greek gods or the Roman gods, that Greek and Roman pantheon, that certain heroic or significant individuals will join the gods on Mount Olympus. And this will be carried over into the Roman emperors, that they become deified so that when they die, they will be elevated and become objects of worship and divinization. But that seems to be more the exception than the rule. And then just overall, no one in the classical world, in the Greek, the Roman, the Persian world, was raised from the dead. Once the body was dead, the body was abandoned. That's it, because the body is unimportant. Unless it's a matter of the body is the only thing that's important, but once you're dead, and there's really nothing beyond that. Resurrection is not an option. Not even resuscitation. Even resuscitation is not an option. Now, you may be familiar with some of the Greek and Roman myths where a ghostly figure will come and appear to somebody to give them a message. That's not quite the same thing. That's the exception rather than the rule. But you can either be like Homer and embrace the idea that the soul exists in a state of gloom, and so the afterlife should be rejected for the enjoyments of the present life, or that the present life should be rejected for the enjoyments of the afterlife if you're Plato. The bottom line is this: those who followed Homer's view knew they would never receive another body. Those that followed Plato didn't want another body because the body was a bad thing. Why would you want to be raised from the dead? It makes no sense. That's why it's problematic when somebody like Paul comes along and says, well, somebody's already been raised from the dead, and you too will be raised from the dead. Oh, I don't want to be raised from the dead. Resurrection is a dirty, disgusting, nasty thing. I don't want this body. This is part of the reason why Paul was probably driving that point home in 1 Corinthians 15. So just a few final thoughts before we completely depart from here. The Greeks and the Romans claimed to see and encounter the dead, but only as spirits, never as a resurrected body or even bodies or resuscitated bodies. There are some stories about a life in the underworld or life in the afterworld, but there's no sense of bodily resurrection. There is that idea that Plato mentions briefly a few times, the transmigration of souls, or what we might call a kind of reincarnation, but this is not a intermediate state awaiting resurrection. And then lastly, the Stoics believed the universe would be destroyed by fire and then remade again into a new universe. But there's still, even in the sense of a new creation, there's no sense of a bodily resurrection, just remaking this world, even no sense of resuscitation. So the main point is this. This is the type of atmosphere in which Judaism is affirming, more than anything else, affirming their ideas of Old Testament resurrection, and this stuff is not it. The things that we've been talking about with the Persians and the Greek is not resurrection. A completely different view of creation, of new creation, the body and the new body. And there is no sense of hope. Even among the Platonic ideas, the disembodied soul and the afterlife, it's still not really the best sense of an afterlife. And so when Jesus begins his ministry, and then when his apostles, after his resurrection and ascension into heaven, continue his ministry, it's really in a world of hopelessness. There's profound hopelessness in the first century AD, because for the most part, most people in the Roman Empire believed this is it. Even when they worship gods, even when they worship their ancestors or something along those lines, there's very much a fatalistic approach to life. And so people are often very empty. And when the apostles go out into the Roman Empire and they begin to evangelize, yeah, it's an uphill battle, but at the same time, there's a tremendous source of hope that's found in the gospel message. This is not all there is, and what there is so much better than what Platonic ideas and other individuals have in regard to the afterlife. It's truly more than resuscitation. It is a reversal and a conquering of death. This is why that type of language and that type of phrasing is often used so much. Any final questions or parting statements or shots or anything like that? Well, next week we'll look at first century Judaism, first century AD. So we'll look at the Sadducees and some of the passages in the Gospels where Jesus has a bit of a headbutting, if you like, with the Sadducees, but we'll also look at some of the other ideas, the Pharisees and others, in regard to very clear understanding of resurrection at the time that Jesus is beginning his earthly ministry. Let me close us with prayer. Father, in the midst of all of the different ideas about what happens when we die and all of the confusion and uncertainty and genuine fear that people have, we need to remember, in the midst of all that we've dealt with and all that we will look at over the next few weeks, we need to remember one thing. We have hope. We have hope in Jesus Christ and a God who lives, who wants to be in relationship with us and wants to restore us to an even better relationship than we have now. We have hope in a future resurrection, not a resuscitation or reconstitution or especially even an annihilation, but the fact that there is life beyond this life, and it's even better than this life, and that you're not done with us in this life or in the next. Help us to live that hope out. And I pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.